There was possibly a feeling among liberal Americans in New York that Trump was had sort of escaped, the accountability that, for instance, Michael Cohen made that payment to Stormy Daniels that the case revolves around and went to prison for 3 years. And Trump, because he was president, was shielded from it.
A judge has sentenced Donald Trump to an unconditional discharge in his hush money case, bringing an end to the historic trial. Trump will be the first convicted felon to head to the White House following the ruling, which the president-elect called a terrible experience. In May, a judge in New York had found him guilty of attempting to conceal the payments to the porn star Stormy Daniels. So no jail, probation or financial penalty. What impact will this have? Let's speak to Will Pavia, New York correspondent for The Times. Will, this has been a long time coming, and you'd have thought that Trump would have just shrugged his shoulders. I mean, after all, he's back with a huge majority, but it clearly irks him. Why does it irk him so?
I think it's a bad news day for him, which he doesn't particularly like, and it does confirm the conviction by a jury last year. He's sort of done everything he possibly could to delay all of the cases, and it's worked out with two of them. It's worked out with the case in DC, where he was charged with attempting to overturn the 2020 election results, and in Florida, where he was charged with holding on to classified documents and taking them to Mar-a-Lago and refusing to return them. His attorneys delayed, and then he won the election, and both cases were dismissed in different ways. And I think the thinking must have been from his attorneys that if they could just delay sentencing until January the 20th, then no proceedings against him as president could take place, because there's a Justice Department understanding that you don't have criminal proceedings against a sitting president. And so the whole thing would sort of go away and it would never be resolved. And I think that's the way he prefers it. This, even though there's no penalty, there's no jail time, there's no fine, this does sort of seal in the record the fact that he's a convicted felon.
Yeah, I'm struck by the words of prosecutor Joshua Steinglass, who argued that Trump had, and I quote, engaged in a campaign to undermine the rule of law. He's been unrelenting in his attacks against his court, prosecutors, and their family. His dangerous rhetoric and unconstitutional conduct has been a direct attack. And he's publicly threatened to retaliate against the prosecutors. But what figure did he cut today? I know he wasn't in court. It was done via Zoom. But how did he come across?
So we saw him for the very first time. I was in the courtroom, and he sort of flashed onto these monitors. Him and his attorney, Todd Blanche, looked like they were sitting behind a desk at Mar-a-Lago. They had like a sort of a varnished kind of dark wood wall behind them and two American flags. And while Joshua Steinglass was talking, he was sort of hunched forward a little bit in his seat, and he was doing that sort of thing where his eyes were almost half closed. When the judge, offered him the chance to speak before his sentencing, and he took it, he became rather animated. He was leaning forward and sort of looking into the camera, presumably looking at the judge, because the sort of screen that he was, was angled towards the judge. And he spoke in this sort of drawl. He didn't say anything that we haven't really heard him say before. But one of the interesting things he said, apart from him thinking that it was a witch hunt and that it was, lawfare and so on, he sort of implied that it was this case that helped him get elected, because he argued that the American people saw that this case was very unfair against him and thus returned him to the White House. So that was sort of his, he wasn't, I wouldn't say he was sort of, it was a rather rambling speech that he gave. It didn't look particularly well prepared. It sort of went into different sort of things that irritated him, and occasionally he seemed almost to veer quite close to breaking the gag order that the judge had imposed on him by talking about one of the witnesses. He talked about Michael Cohen, but he sort of did it without saying his name.
Yes.
But so he cut a sort of fairly, I would suppose, stubborn figure. That there was no real remorse. And he maintained the whole thing was inappropriate.
Sure. And so you were at the court. I see that both supporters and detractors were gathered outside the venue during the sentencing. How do you think this will go down in New York, which is, of course, still an overwhelmingly Democratic city?
It's interesting. I think it is like a somewhat controversial case. Alvin Bragg is not the most popular prosecutor in the city. His early tenure was slightly marred by this memo that he sent out, which sort of implied that there would be a much sort of softer approach to some kind of crimes. And at the time, New York was seeing a spike in crime, and it went down quite badly. And so I think there was general support for this case in New York City, and there was possibly a feeling among liberal Americans in New York that Trump was had sort of escaped, the accountability that, for instance, Michael Cohen made that payment to Stormy Daniels that the case revolves around and went to prison for 3 years, and Trump, because he was president, was shielded from it. And so I think there was some sympathy with the case, although I think a lot of people regarded this case as possibly the least serious of the cases that Trump was charged with. I think to New Yorkers, it was a sort of thing that while it was happening in May, it was a big deal. The Lower Manhattan was shut down. There may perhaps be a feeling that why have we spent all this money
Yes,
for
for
a sort of
unconditional discharge.
symbolic? Yes, exactly. But I think in New York City that there would probably be higher approval ratings for the trial than elsewhere in the country, where people sort of did sort of take Trump's attitude that it was some sort of weaponization of justice.
Yeah. One more thing. People may remember the name of Jack Smith, a special counsel, and he has written a report into his attempt to prosecute the president elect for trying to overturn his 2020 election defeat in various guises. Now, what do we know of the Justice Department's intentions? Because they could release it before election, I mean, it's not election day, inauguration day.
They could, yes. I mean, it seems as if they do intend to. I mean, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, has sort of always said that he would try to be as transparent as possible in all of this. It's obviously a very delicate sort of matter, and the special counsel was handling. I mean, if they don't publish it before January the 20th, then it won't be published. I think we can safely say, because Trump will order the Justice Department not to publish it. So I would think that there will be an effort to put it out before January the 20th, and that's sort of what they're sort of fighting about in the courts at the moment. But yeah, I would be quite surprised if they don't make a pretty strenuous effort to get it out before then.
All right, Will, thank you very much indeed. It's been great talking to you. That's Will Pavia, New York correspondent for The Times. Your response to that, please. What do you think about it? After all that time and all that money, Trump got an unconditional discharge, just a symbolic utterance from the judge there. And he said, Godspeed with your second term. Oh, my. Respect for the office of President of the United States.